The dining hall of the starship Aurora's Edge buzzed with voices from across the galaxy. Commander Jake Morrison stood near the large viewing window, watching distant stars while alien delegates filled the room behind him. The ship had been traveling for 3 weeks now, carrying representatives from 6 different species to the neutral meeting station at Kepler 442. This was humanity's first major diplomatic mission since joining the Galactic Council, and Jake felt the weight of that responsibility on his shoulders. The dinner was supposed to be a simple getting-to-know-you event, but Jake knew nothing was ever simple when dealing with alien politics. He turned from the window and walked toward his assigned table, nodding politely to the various delegates as he passed. The Vortans sat perfectly still at their crystal table, their transparent bodies catching the light like living diamonds. The Nebulites floated in their environmental suits, their gaseous forms shifting colors as they communicated through chemical signals. The Chitarians clicked and buzzed at each other, their insect-like heads turning in perfect unison whenever someone new entered the room. But it was the Zephyrians who commanded the most attention. They were tall, these blue-skinned warriors, standing nearly 7 feet high with broad shoulders and confident postures. Their leader, Ambassador Kale Vor, sat at the center table like a king holding court. His metallic blue skin caught the light, and his yellow eyes scanned the room with the look of someone who had never met an equal. Jake took his seat at the human table, joining his senior staff. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Paul Rogers was already there, along with Engineer Captain Ben Davis and Communications Officer Lieutenant Kate Murphy. Dr. Lisa Carter, their xenobiologist, sat quietly at the end of the table, her tablet in hand as she observed the other species with scientific interest. The meal began with traditional foods from each species, though most of it looked nothing like anything Jake had ever seen. The Zephyrians ate some kind of blue meat that seemed to move on their plates, while the Vortans absorbed nutrients through their crystal skin by touching small energy cubes. The humans had brought simple earth foods, which seemed to fascinate some of the other delegates. Conversation started slowly, with each group talking mostly among themselves. But as the evening went on and various beverages were consumed, the atmosphere became more relaxed. It was Ambassador Kyle Vor who first addressed the entire room, standing up with his glass raised high. "Fellow beings of the galaxy," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Tonight we celebrate the expansion of our great council. We welcome our newest members, the humans, though they have much to learn about the ways of advanced civilizations." Jake felt his jaw tighten at the condescending tone, but he kept his expression neutral. This was diplomacy, after all. Kale Vor continued, his yellow eyes sweeping across the room. "Each species here tonight has something unique to offer. The Vortans bring their perfect logic and crystal technology. The Nebulites share their mastery over atmospheric sciences. The Chitarians provide their collective intelligence and hive coordination." He paused dramatically, taking a sip from his glass before continuing. "But my people, the Zephyrians, offer something that no other species can claim. We have achieved the ultimate evolution. We have conquered the most primitive and useless of all emotions. We have eliminated fear." A murmur went through the room. Several delegates nodded approvingly, particularly the Vortans, whose leader's crystal body pulsed with what Jake assumed was agreement. "Fear," Kale Vor said, his voice growing stronger, "is the weakness that holds back lesser species. It makes beings hesitate when they should act. It clouds judgment when clarity is needed. It prevents growth when advancement is possible." He gestured broadly, encompassing the entire room. For over 10,000 years, my people have used genetic modification and mental conditioning to remove this flaw from our nature. We do not fear death, for we understand it is merely another state of existence. We do not fear pain, for we have learned to use it as information. We do not fear the unknown, for we possess the wisdom to understand that knowledge conquers all mysteries. The room had grown quiet, all attention focused on the tall ambassador. Even the Chitarians had stopped their constant clicking to listen. "My species," Kael'vor declared, raising his glass higher, "dreads nothing in this universe. We are the only truly fearless beings in the galaxy, and this is why we will lead the Council to greater achievements than ever before imagined." The alien delegates erupted in what Jake assumed was applause, though it sounded more like a collection of strange noises. The Vortans pulsed brighter, the Nebulites changed to warmer colors, and the Chitarians resumed their clicking in what seemed to be an approving pattern. Jake noticed that his own team remained silent. Dr. Carter was still taking notes on her tablet, though he caught a small smile on her face. Dr. Rogers looked skeptical, while Engineer Davis just seemed confused by the whole display. When the noise died down, Kael'vor looked directly at Jake. "Commander Morrison," he said, "perhaps you would like to share what humanity considers its greatest achievement? Though I suspect it will seem quite modest compared to what my people have accomplished." Jake stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room upon him. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that someone would eventually ask. But after Kael'vor's grand speech about fearlessness, anything he said would sound weak by comparison. "Ambassador Kael'vor," Jake said, keeping his voice steady, "humanity's greatest achievement isn't something we've eliminated or conquered. It's something we've embraced. Our curiosity has driven us to explore beyond our home planet. Our adaptability has helped us survive in environments we were never meant to live in, and our willingness to learn from others has brought us here tonight." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each delegate. "We don't claim to be perfect or to have evolved beyond basic emotions. We're probably the most flawed species at this table, but we've learned that our flaws often lead to our greatest discoveries, and our fears often point us toward what we need to understand most." The room was quiet for a moment. Jake could see that his words had not impressed the alien delegates, the way Kael'vor's had. The Vortans seemed confused by the concept of embracing flaws, and the Nebulites had shifted to darker, more neutral colors. Kael'vor smiled, though it didn't reach his yellow eyes. "How refreshingly humble," he said. "Perhaps, in time, your species will learn to overcome these limitations. The Zephyrians would be happy to share our methods of mental advancement." "That's very generous," Jake replied, sitting back down. He caught Dr. Carter's eye and saw that her small smile had grown larger. She was still taking notes, but now she seemed to be writing faster, as if something important had just occurred to her. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Jake noticed that Dr. Carter remained quiet for the rest of the evening, observing the Zephyrians with intense interest. When Ambassador Kael'vor told stories of his people's great battles and conquests, always emphasizing how they had faced every danger without fear, Carter's typing became more rapid. As the evening wound down and delegates began returning to their quarters, Jake approached his xenobiologist. "Find something interesting tonight, Doctor." Carter looked up from her tablet, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement Jake had learned to associate with scientific discovery. "Actually, Commander, I think I found something fascinating, but I need to do some research first." "About the Zephyrians?" About fear, she said simply, and what it really means to live without it. Jake watched as she headed toward the exit, her mind clearly already working on whatever theory she was developing. He had learned to trust Dr. Carter's instincts when it came to alien behavior, and if she thought something was worth investigating about the Zephyrians' claims, then it probably was. The dining hall slowly emptied, leaving only the cleanup crew and the distant hum of the ship's engines. Jake took one last look at the viewing window, where the stars continued their eternal dance across the darkness of space. Tomorrow they would reach the meeting station, and the real negotiations would begin. But tonight had been about first impressions. And he wondered what impression humanity had really made on their new alien allies. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he found himself thinking about Dr. Carter's final words. What did it really mean to live without fear? And more. Importantly, was it really something to be proud of? 3 days had passed since the dinner, and Dr. Lisa Carter had spent most of that time buried in research. Her small laboratory aboard the Aurora's Edge was cluttered with data tablets, alien physiology charts, and psychological analysis reports. She had been studying everything the human database contained about Zephyrian biology and behavior, and the more she learned, the more convinced she became that something was not right about Ambassador Cale Vor's claims. The Zephyrians were indeed an impressive species. Their genetic modifications had given them enhanced strength, improved reflexes, and resistance to many diseases that plagued other races. Their mental conditioning programs were legendary throughout the galaxy, producing warriors and leaders who could function under extreme stress. But as Carter dug deeper into the data, she began to notice patterns that troubled her scientific mind. Every report about Zephyrian behavior mentioned their absolute confidence and lack of fear responses. But the reports also mentioned other things. Zephyrians never looked in mirrors unless absolutely necessary. Their art contained no self-portraits. Their literature focused entirely on external conflicts and never explored internal struggles. Their philosophy rejected introspection as a waste of time. For a species that claimed to have achieved perfect self-awareness through evolution, they seemed remarkably uninterested in actually examining themselves. Carter pushed back from her desk and rubbed her tired eyes. She had been working for 14 hours straight, and her conclusions were becoming clearer with each piece of data she analyzed. The Zephyrians had not conquered fear through evolution. They had simply redirected it so completely that they no longer recognized it as fear. She needed to test her theory, but that would require getting close to Ambassador Cale Vor himself. Carter knew that approaching him directly with her suspicions would be useless. His pride would never allow him to admit that his species might be flawed, but perhaps she could frame it as a scientific exchange, something that would appeal to his sense of superiority. Carter found Cale Vor in the ship's observation lounge, standing alone before the large windows that showed the swirling colors of hyperspace. He was perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his yellow eyes fixed on the shifting lights outside. He looked like a statue, completely motionless and apparently deep in thought. "Ambassador," Carter said as she approached, keeping her voice respectful and professional. Cale Vor turned slowly, his expression neutral. "Dr. Carter, I was not expecting company. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to discuss something with you, if you have a few minutes." "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested he was merely being polite. "What can I do for humanity's xenobiologist?" Carter took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I've been studying the reports about your species since our dinner 3 nights ago. Your people's achievements in genetic modification and mental conditioning are truly remarkable. Kale Vor's posture straightened slightly, and Carter caught a hint of satisfaction in his yellow eyes. We have worked for many generations to perfect ourselves. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, Carter continued. As a scientist, I'm fascinated by the biological and psychological mechanisms that allow your people to function without fear. I was wondering if you might be willing to participate in some simple tests that could help me understand how this works. The ambassador's expression shifted to one of mild curiosity. What kind of tests? Nothing invasive or uncomfortable, Carter assured him. Just some basic psychological assessments and neural monitoring. I'd like to measure your responses to various stimuli that typically provoke fear reactions in other species. It would be purely for scientific research, and the data could be valuable for understanding how other species might benefit from similar conditioning. Kale Vor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying Carter's face. She could see him weighing the request, probably wondering if there was some trick involved. But his pride was stronger than his caution. You wish to study my people's superiority, he said finally, to see how we have achieved what your species has not. Exactly, Carter said, though the words left a bad taste in her mouth. Your fearlessness is clearly the result of advanced evolution. Understanding it could help other species, including humanity. Very well, Kyle Vor said, his chest swelling with obvious pride. I will demonstrate for you the difference between a primitive fear response and true evolutionary advancement. When would you like to conduct these tests? Would tomorrow morning work for you? I can set everything up in the medical bay. Tomorrow is acceptable. But I must warn you, Dr. Carter, you will find nothing in my responses that resembles the weakness your species calls fear. My people have moved beyond such primitive reactions. Carter nodded seriously. I'm sure the results will be very educational. As she walked away from the observation lounge, Carter felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Her theory was about to be put to the test, and she hoped she was wrong. If she was right about what she suspected, the implications would be disturbing not just for the Zephyrians, but for the entire Galactic Council. The next morning, Carter arrived early at the medical bay to set up her equipment. She had borrowed several neural monitoring devices from Dr. Rogers, along with a collection of stimuli designed to test fear responses. She also had her tablet loaded with video files, audio recordings, and images that had been known to provoke anxiety in various alien species. When Kale Vor arrived, he looked around the medical bay with obvious confidence. He seemed completely relaxed, as if he were about to take a simple medical exam rather than undergo psychological testing. Is all this equipment really necessary? He asked, gesturing at the monitoring devices. It's the only way to get accurate measurements, Carter explained as she began attaching sensors to his arms and forehead. These will monitor your heart rate, brain activity, and stress hormone levels. They're completely harmless. Kale Vor submitted to the procedure with good humor, even making jokes about human technology being unnecessarily complex. Carter finished the setup and activated the monitoring systems, watching as baseline readings appeared on her screens. Excellent, she said. Your baseline readings are very stable. Now, I'm going to show you a series of images and sounds, and I want you to simply observe them normally. Don't try to control your reactions in any way. Doctor, Kale Vor said with amusement, I could not control my reactions even if I wanted to. My people do not experience fear. There will be nothing to control. Carter nodded and began the first test. She showed him images of predatory animals from various worlds, recordings of weapon fire and explosions, and scenarios involving extreme heights and dangerous situations. As expected, Kael'vor showed no significant response to any of them. His heart rate remained steady, his brain patterns showed no signs of stress, and his hormone levels stayed constant. "Interesting," Carter murmured, making notes on her tablet. "No response at all to any of the standard fear stimuli?" "Of course not," Kael'vor said. "I told you my people have evolved beyond such primitive reactions." Carter continued with more extreme stimuli. She showed him images of combat, recordings of screaming, and videos of disasters and destruction. Still nothing. Kael'vor's readings remained as calm as if he were watching a peaceful sunset. "Your equipment is working properly?" he asked, after several more tests showed no results. "Oh, yes," Carter said, checking her readings again. "It's working perfectly. You really do show no fear response to any of these stimuli." Kael'vor smiled, with obvious satisfaction. "Perhaps now you understand why my people are natural leaders. We can face any danger, any threat, any challenge without hesitation." "Just one more test," Carter said quietly. She had been building up to this moment, and her hands were slightly shaky as she reached into her equipment bag. "This is a simple visual perception test." She pulled out a small, handheld mirror, keeping it face down so Kael'vor could not see the reflective surface. It was nothing special, just a basic mirror she had borrowed from the ship's personal supplies, but based on her research and her theory about Zephyrian psychology, this simple object might be the most powerful stimulus she could possibly use. "A mirror?" Kael'vor asked, his voice showing the first hint of confusion since the testing had begun. "Yes," Carter said, holding it carefully. "I want you to look into this and tell me what you see. It's a test of visual processing and self-recognition." Kael'vor laughed, a sound that echoed through the medical bay. "Dr. Carter, surely you cannot be serious. You think my own reflection will frighten me? This is ridiculous." "Humor me," Carter said, extending the mirror toward him. "Just look into it and describe what you see." Still chuckling at what he obviously considered a foolish human mistake, Kael'vor took the mirror and turned it over to look at his reflection. For a moment, nothing happened. He looked into the mirror with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout all the other tests. Then, something changed. Carter watched her monitoring equipment in amazement as every single reading suddenly spiked into the red zone. Kael'vor's heart rate doubled, then tripled. His brain activity exploded with patterns she had never seen before. Stress hormones flooded his. Ambassador Kael'vor stood in the corner of the medical bay, as far from the broken mirror pieces as possible. His breathing was still uneven, and his hands continued to shake despite his obvious efforts to control them. Dr. Carter had never seen a Zephyrian look anything other than perfectly composed. But now Kael'vor looked like a person whose entire world had suddenly collapsed around him. "This is impossible," he kept repeating, his voice barely above a whisper. "My people do not fear. We have conquered fear. This cannot be real." Carter finished shutting down her equipment and turned to face him fully. She knew she had to handle this moment carefully. What she had just witnessed was not just a scientific breakthrough, but potentially a psychological crisis for the ambassador. "Kael'vor," she said gently, using his name without his title for the first time. "What did you see when you looked in the mirror?" He flinched at the question, his yellow eyes darting toward the broken pieces of glass on the floor before quickly looking away again. "I saw nothing. Just my reflection. There was nothing unusual about it." But something about seeing your reflection caused the strongest fear response I've ever recorded from any species, Carter said. Your heart rate increased by 300%. Your stress hormone levels reached dangerous peaks. Your brain activity showed patterns consistent with extreme terror. That is not possible, Kyle Vor said, but his voice lacked conviction. The equipment must be malfunctioning. Your human technology is primitive compared to Zephyrian science. Carter pulled up the data on her tablet and showed him the readings. These are the most accurate measurements available in the galaxy. There's no malfunction here. When you looked in that mirror, you experienced fear on a level that most species reserve for life-threatening situations. Vor stared at the data for a long moment, his face showing confusion and something that might have been dawning horror. But I felt nothing. I experienced no fear. This data must be wrong. Or, Carter said carefully, you felt fear, but didn't recognize it as such. Tell me exactly what went through your mind when you looked in the mirror. The ambassador was quiet. For several minutes, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low Carter had to strain to hear him. I saw myself, he said, but not as I usually see myself. Not as the perfect warrior my people have made me. I saw... He paused, struggling with words. I saw weakness. I saw doubt. I saw questions that I have never allowed myself to ask. Carter nodded slowly. What kind of questions? Questions about whether my people are truly as advanced as we claim. Questions about whether our fearlessness is real strength or just another kind of weakness. Questions about what we might have lost when we eliminated our ability to be afraid. He looked up at Carter suddenly, his eyes wide with realization. Those thoughts, those doubts, that uncertainty I felt when looking at myself, that was fear, wasn't it? Yes, Carter said simply. That was fear. The fear of seeing yourself clearly. The fear of questioning everything you've been taught to believe. The fear of discovering that you might not be who you think you are. Vor sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. But this makes no sense. If I can experience fear, then everything my people believe about ourselves is wrong. Everything. We have achieved everything we pride ourselves on. It's all built on a lie. Carter sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. Not a lie, exactly. Your people really have eliminated most fear responses. You don't fear physical danger, death, pain, or external threats, but you've eliminated those fears by avoiding the one fear that makes all others possible. I don't understand. Self-awareness, Carter explained. The fear of truly knowing yourself. Your people have spent thousands of years looking outward, conquering external fears by refusing to look inward. You've created a society that never examines itself, never questions its own nature, never allows its members to see themselves clearly. She gestured toward the broken mirror. That's why a simple reflection could cause such a powerful fear response. Your mind has been trained to avoid self-examination so completely that when you're forced to truly see yourself, it triggers the very fear response you thought you had eliminated. Vor looked up at her with something approaching desperation. But why would self-awareness cause fear? What is there to be afraid of in knowing yourself? Because, Carter said, when you really look at yourself, you might not like what you see. You might discover that you're not as perfect as you thought. You might realize that you have flaws, weaknesses, doubts, and uncertainties just like every other thinking being in the universe. And this is supposed to be good. This fear, this doubt, this uncertainty. How can humans function while carrying such burdens? Carter smiled sadly. It's not easy. Every morning, humans wake up and look in mirrors. We see our imperfections, our aging, our mistakes reflected back at us. We spend our lives confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves. We question our decisions, doubt our abilities, and worry about our futures. That sounds terrible, Vor said. Why would you choose to live that way? Because the alternative is what your people have done, Carter replied. You've eliminated the fear of self-knowledge, but you've also eliminated the possibility of real growth. How can you improve if you never see your flaws? How can you learn if you never question your assumptions? How can you become better if you never admit that you might not be perfect right now? She leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. Your people claim to have achieved the ultimate evolution, but evolution requires change. Change requires recognizing that your current state might not be your best possible state. And that recognition requires the courage to look at yourself honestly, even when it's frightening. Vor was quiet for a long time, processing what she had said. Finally, he asked, Are you saying that fear is necessary? That it serves a purpose? I'm saying that the fear of self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, Carter said. When you're willing to face uncomfortable truths about yourself, you create the possibility of becoming something better. When you eliminate that willingness, you stop growing. But my people are advanced, Vor protested. We have achieved great things. We have conquered worlds, built mighty civilizations, developed technologies that other species envy. You've achieved external greatness, Carter agreed. But what about internal growth? When was the last time Zephyrian philosophy evolved? When did your people last question their fundamental beliefs? When did your society examine whether its values might need updating? Vor opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. After several moments, he said quietly, We do not engage in such activities. We consider them wasteful and counterproductive. Because they require you to look inward. Because they require you to admit that you might be wrong about something. Because they require the very self-examination that triggers the fear response you experienced when you looked in that mirror. The ambassador stood up abruptly and began pacing around the medical bay, carefully avoiding the broken glass. If what you're saying is true, then my entire species has been living a delusion. We've convinced ourselves that we're fearless when we're actually more afraid than anyone else in the galaxy. Not more afraid, Carter corrected. Just afraid of something different. Most species fear external threats. Your people fear internal. Examination. And ironically, that fear has made you unable to see that you're afraid. Vor stopped pacing and turned to face her. How do humans bear it? This constant self-examination? This willingness to see your own flaws and weaknesses? Doesn't it make you weak? Doesn't it make you hesitate when action is needed? Sometimes, Carter admitted, but it also makes us stronger in ways your people have never experienced. When we make mistakes, we can acknowledge them and learn from them. When we encounter new situations, we can adapt because we're not locked into thinking we already have all the answers. When we face challenges, we can grow because we're not afraid to admit that we might need to become better than we are. She stood up and walked to the viewing port, looking out at the stars beyond. Your people have achieved a kind of perfection, Vor. But it's a static perfection. You've made yourselves into beautiful, flawless statues. Humans remain messy, imperfect, constantly changing works of art. And you prefer that? He asked. We prefer the possibility of becoming something we've never been before, Carter said, even if it means accepting that what we are right now might not be enough. Cale Vor joined her at the viewing port, though he stood carefully to one side so he could not see his reflection in the glass. I don't know how to process this information. I don't know what to do with what I've learned about myself and my people. That's fear, too, Carter said gently. The fear of uncertainty, of not knowing what comes next. But it's also the beginning of wisdom. They stood in silence for several minutes, both looking out at the stars. Finally, Cale Vor spoke again. Dr. Carter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. When you look in a mirror, when you see your own flaws and imperfections reflected back at you, are you afraid? Carter considered the question carefully before answering. Yes, she said. The next 3 days were unlike anything Dr. Carter had ever witnessed. Ambassador Cale Vor had left the medical bay a changed being, and the change was not subtle. Word spread quickly through the ship that something was wrong with the Zephyrian diplomat, though no one knew exactly what had happened. Carter watched from a distance as Cale Vor began to unravel. He stopped attending the daily diplomatic briefings, sending messages that he was conducting private research. He avoided the common areas where other delegates gathered, and when he did appear, he moved differently. Gone was the confident stride and perfect posture. Instead, he walked with his head down, his eyes constantly scanning for reflective surfaces that he might accidentally encounter. The ship's corridors had many polished metal panels that could show reflections, and Carter observed Cale Vor taking increasingly elaborate routes to avoid them. He would stop suddenly at corners, peer around them carefully, and sometimes turn around entirely rather than walk past a particularly shiny surface. What had once been a proud and commanding presence now seemed fearful and uncertain. Dr. Paul. Rogers found Carter in her laboratory on the second day after the experiment. Lisa, what exactly did you do to that Zephyrian? Commander Morrison is getting concerned reports from the other delegates about his behavior. Carter looked up from her research notes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. I proved a theory about Zephyrian psychology, but I'm not sure the proof was worth the cost. What kind of theory? She explained the experiment and its results to Rogers, who listened with growing amazement and concern. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and whistled softly. So you're telling me that their entire species has been living in denial about their own nature? Not denial exactly, Carter said. More like a systematic avoidance of self-awareness that's become so complete they don't even realize they're doing it. And now Cale Vor is experiencing what? Some kind of psychological breakdown? He's experiencing self-awareness for the first time in his life, Carter said. Imagine if you had spent 40 years thinking you were brave, strong, and perfect, and then suddenly discovered that you were terrified of your own reflection. How would you handle that? Rogers frowned. Probably not well. Have you tried talking to him again? I've tried. He won't see me. I think he blames me for destroying his worldview. Did you destroy it, or did you reveal that it was already broken? Carter considered the question. Maybe both. I'm starting to think that some truths are too dangerous to reveal. But the situation was about to get much worse. On the third day, the other Zephyrian delegates finally confronted their ambassador. Carter happened to be walking past the conference room when she heard raised voices coming from inside. She stopped to listen, knowing she probably shouldn't but unable to resist. Cale Vor, Your behavior is becoming a disgrace to our species, came the voice of Sub-Ambassador Zin Ra, Kyle Vor's second-in-command. The other delegates are beginning to question our competence. What has happened to you? I have seen, came Kyle Vor's voice, hollow and shaking. I have seen what we really are. What are you talking about? You speak in riddles and act like a frightened child. This is not the behavior of an evolved Zephyrian. Evolved, Kyle Vor laughed, but there was no humor in it. We are not evolved. We are the most terrified species in the galaxy, and we are too afraid to admit it. Carter heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Probably the other Zephyrians standing up in shock. You will explain yourself immediately, Zin Ra demanded. What has caused this breakdown in your mental conditioning? The human, xenobiologist, Kyle Vor said. She showed me something simple and terrible. What did she show you? There was a long pause before Kyle Vor answered. She showed me myself. Carter heard more movement from inside the room, and then Zin Ra's voice again, colder now. We will investigate this matter immediately. If the humans have used some form of psychological warfare against you, there will be consequences. It was not warfare, Kyle Vor said. It was just a mirror. The conference room door suddenly opened, and 3 Zephyrian delegates emerged, their faces dark with anger. They walked past Carter without acknowledging her presence, but she could see the determination in their movements. They were heading for Commander Morrison's quarters. Carter quickly made her way to the bridge, knowing she needed to warn Jake about what was coming. She found him reviewing navigation charts with Engineer Davis. Commander, we have a problem, she said. Jake looked up, taking in her worried expression. Let me guess. This is about Ambassador Kyle Vor and whatever you did in your experiment. They're coming to see you. The other Zephyrians. They think I used psychological warfare against their ambassador. Did you? Carter hesitated. I showed him the truth about his species. Whether that counts as warfare depends on how you define it. Before Jake could respond, the bridge doors opened and the 3 Zephyrian delegates entered. Their leader, Zin Ra, approached with barely controlled fury. Commander Morrison, Zin Ra said, his voice tight with anger. We demand an immediate explanation for the psychological attack your scientist has conducted against Ambassador Kyle Vor. Jake stood slowly, his expression neutral. I'm not aware of any attack, Sub-Ambassador. Perhaps you could explain what you're referring to. Your Dr. Carter has used some form of mental manipulation to cause a complete breakdown in our ambassador's psychological conditioning. He is now exhibiting behaviors that are completely contrary to Zephyrian nature. What kind of behaviors? Jake asked. Fear. Zin Ra spat the word like it was poison. She has somehow induced fear responses in a being who was genetically and mentally conditioned to be incapable of such primitive reactions. Carter stepped forward. Sub-Ambassador, I didn't induce anything. I simply revealed responses that were already there. Impossible, Zin Ra said, turning his attention to her. Zephyrians do not experience fear. It has been eliminated from our nature through centuries of advancement. With respect, Carter said, that's not what my data shows. Your data is irrelevant, Zin Ra replied. What matters is that you have violated several interspecies treaties regarding psychological manipulation and mental warfare. We demand that you immediately reverse whatever you have done to our ambassador. Jake looked at Carter questioningly. Dr. Carter, is it possible to reverse the effects of your experiment? Carter shook her head. Commander, you can't reverse. Someone learning the truth about themselves. What's been seen cannot be unseen. Then you admit you have permanently damaged our ambassador. Zinra said triumphantly. I admit I've changed his perspective, Carter replied. Whether that's damage or growth depends on your point of view. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Engineer Davis had quietly moved to a communication panel, probably alerting security to the situation. The other Zephyrian delegates flanked their leader, their postures suggesting they were prepared for conflict. We will not allow this attack on our species to go unanswered, Zinra declared. If Ambassador Vor cannot be restored to his proper state, we will file formal complaints with the Galactic Council and demand that humanity be expelled from all diplomatic relations. That seems like an extreme response, Jake said carefully. You do not understand what you have done, Zinra continued. Zephyrian society is built upon our fearlessness. If word spreads that we can experience fear, it will undermine everything we have achieved. Other species will see us as weak. Our enemies will exploit this knowledge. Our own people will begin to question their conditioning. Carter suddenly understood the real scope of what her experiment had revealed. This wasn't just about one ambassador having a psychological crisis. The entire Zephyrian civilization was built on a foundation that she had just proven to be false. If her findings became public knowledge, it could destabilize their entire society. Sub-ambassador, she said quietly, what if the ability to experience fear isn't a weakness? What if it's actually a strength that your people have been denying themselves? Preposterous, Zinra replied. Fear is the enemy of progress, the destroyer of courage, the foundation of failure. Or, Carter countered, fear is the beginning of wisdom, the source of caution, and the foundation of growth. Your human philosophies are irrelevant, Zinra said. We demand immediate action to resolve this situation. Jake looked between the angry Zephyrians and his own xenobiologist, realizing that he was facing a diplomatic crisis that could have consequences far beyond their current mission. The wrong decision here could affect humanity's entire relationship with the Galactic Council. Dr. Carter, he said finally, I need you to prepare a full report on your experiment and its results. Sub-Ambassador Zinra, I suggest we call an emergency meeting of all delegates to discuss this situation openly. We will not discuss our internal affairs with other species, Zinra said firmly. Then you're going to have a problem, Jake replied, because what Dr. Carter discovered affects more than just the Zephyrians. As if summoned by his words, the bridge doors opened again, and representatives from the other alien species began to enter. Word of the confrontation had spread throughout the ship, and everyone wanted to know what was happening. The main conference room had never held so many different species at once. Representatives from all 6 civilizations sat around the large table, while additional delegates stood along the walls. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to affect even the ship's air recycling system, which hummed louder than usual. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the head of the table, looking out at faces both human and alien. To his right sat the angry Zephyrian delegation, led by Sub-Ambassador Zinra. To his left, Dr. Carter sat quietly with her research tablet, looking like she wished she could disappear. The other alien species watched everything with intense curiosity, clearly sensing that something important was happening but not yet understanding what. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, Jake began, we're here to address a situation that has arisen between our species and our Zephyrian guests. Dr. Carter, would you please explain what happened? Carter stood slowly, her hands shaking slightly, as she activated her tablet. 3 days ago, I conducted a psychological experiment with Ambassador Vor. The purpose was to understand how Zephyrian fearlessness works on a biological and psychological level. She tapped her tablet, and a holographic display appeared above the table showing her experimental data. The results were unexpected. While Ambassador Vor showed no fear response to traditional stimuli, he experienced an extreme fear reaction when shown his own reflection in a mirror. Murmurs went around the room. The crystalline vortans pulsed with what Jake assumed was surprise. While the gaseous nebulites shifted to darker colors, Sub-Ambassador Zin-Ra stood up angrily. This human used psychological manipulation to cause a breakdown in our ambassador's mental conditioning. She has violated multiple interspecies treaties and damaged a diplomat of the Galactic Council. With respect, Carter said, her voice growing stronger. I didn't manipulate anything. I simply revealed what was already there. Explain this mirror test, requested Crystalline Leader Vex 9 of the Vortans, her voice chiming like musical notes. How does reflection cause fear in a fearless being? Carter took a deep breath. The Zephyrians haven't eliminated fear. They've eliminated self-awareness. Their entire society is built on avoiding introspection, self-examination, and honest self-reflection. When Ambassador Vor looked in the mirror, he saw himself clearly for the first time in his life, and that triggered the very fear response his people claim to have conquered. This is ridiculous, Zin-Ra declared. Zephyrians are the most self-aware species in the galaxy. We have achieved perfect understanding of our own nature through genetic modification and mental conditioning. Have you? Carter asked quietly. When was the last time your people created art that explored internal struggles? When did your philosophers last question the fundamental assumptions of your society? When did your literature examine the complexity of individual identity rather than just external conquests? Zin-Ra opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The other Zephyrian delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. You see, Carter continued, true self-awareness requires the courage to face uncomfortable truths about yourself. It requires admitting that you might be wrong, that you might have flaws, that you might not be perfect. And that admission requires accepting fear as a natural part of growth. Hive Speaker Clictor of the Chitarians, his mandibles clicking, rapidly said, this theory implies that fear serves a biological purpose. Our species experiences collective fear that helps protect the hive. Are you suggesting fear is evolutionary advantageous? Exactly, Carter said, turning to address the entire room. Fear isn't a weakness to be eliminated. It's information to be processed. It tells us when we're in danger, when we need to be careful, when we need to grow or change or learn something new. She gestured toward the Zephyrian delegation. By eliminating their ability to feel fear, the Zephyrians have also eliminated their ability to recognize when they need to change. They've created a perfect society that can never become more perfect because it can never acknowledge its imperfections. But surely fearlessness in combat is advantageous, said Flow Current Zaf of the Nebulites, his gaseous form shifting to inquisitive blues and greens. Zephyrian warriors are legendary throughout the galaxy. Their warriors are effective because they don't fear death or pain, Carter agreed. But they're also predictable because they can't adapt their tactics based on new information. They can't learn from defeats because they can't acknowledge that they might have made mistakes. Sub-Ambassador Zin-Ra was growing more agitated. You speak of matters you do not understand, human. Our military successes speak for themselves. Your military successes are impressive, Carter acknowledged. But tell me, when was the last time Zephyrian military doctrine evolved? When did your tactics change to meet new challenges? When did your strategies adapt to unexpected situations? Again, Zin-Ra had no immediate answer. Carter activated another display on her tablet. I've been studying the historical records of all our species. The Zephyrians achieved their current level of military and technological development approximately 3,000 years ago. Since then, their advancement has been essentially static. She showed charts and graphs comparing the development curves of different civilizations. Every other species in this room has continued to grow, adapt, and change over the same time period. Only the Zephyrians have remained essentially unchanged. We achieved perfection, Zin-Ra said defensively. Why would we need to change? Because, came a quiet voice from the back of the room, perfection is not a destination. It's a journey. Everyone turned to see Ambassador War standing in the doorway. He looked terrible. His usually perfect posture was slumped, his metallic blue skin seemed duller, and his yellow eyes were bloodshot and weary. But there was something else in his expression that Jake had never seen before in a Zephyrian. Uncertainty mixed with a strange kind of hope. War, Zin-Ra said sharply. You should not be here. You are not well. I am not well, War agreed as he slowly entered the room. But I am awake. For the first time in my life, I am truly awake. He walked to the center of the room, carefully avoiding looking at any reflective surfaces, but moving with more purpose than he had shown in days. Dr. Carter showed me something that my people have spent millennia hiding from, he said, addressing the entire assembly. She showed me myself, and what I saw was terrifying, not because I am a monster, but because I am not the perfect being I was raised to believe I was. Vor, you are having a psychological breakdown, Zin-Ra said urgently. Your conditioning has been damaged. You are not thinking clearly. My conditioning has been removed, Vor corrected. And for the first time, I am thinking clearly. He turned to face Carter directly. You asked me what I saw in that mirror. I saw doubt. I saw questions. I saw fear. But I also saw something else. I saw possibility. Possibility of what? Asked Crystalline Leader Vex 9. The possibility of becoming better than I am, Vor said simply. The possibility of growth, of change, of learning something new about myself and my people. He looked around the room at all the alien faces. Every species here tonight has something my people lack. The Vortans have continued to refine their logic and philosophy. The Nebulites have developed new forms of artistic expression. The Chitarians have found new ways to balance individual and collective needs. And what about humans? Asked Flow Current Zaf. Vor smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had ever seen from a Zephyrian. Humans have something none of us possess. They have the courage to look in mirrors every day and still get up and try to be better. Carter stepped forward with a proposal that surprised everyone in the room. I'd like to conduct the same mirror test with volunteers from every species present. If you're willing. The room erupted in surprised voices and concerned chatter, but gradually the noise died down as delegates began to consider the offer. What would this prove? Asked Hive Speaker Clicktor. It would prove that courage isn't the absence of fear, Carter said. It's the willingness to face fear and continue forward anyway. One by one, Carter produced small mirrors for the volunteer delegates. The results were illuminating in ways she hadn't expected. The Vortans, who prided themselves on perfect logic, saw the emotional contradictions they tried to suppress. The Nebulites, who celebrated adaptability, saw how rigidly they had structured their society. The Chitarians, who boasted of collective unity, saw their individual loneliness and isolation. Each species experienced the shock of true self-recognition that Vor had felt. Each saw uncomfortable truths about themselves that they had been avoiding, but then Carter turned to the human delegation and offered them mirrors as well. Commander Morrison took one first, looking into it calmly. Dr. Rogers followed, then Engineer Davis, and finally Carter herself. The aliens watched in amazement as the humans looked into their reflections without any signs of distress. They saw their flaws, their imperfections, their fears, and they accepted them all. "How?" whispered Sub-Ambassador Zinra, who had been shaken by his own mirror experience. "How do you bear seeing yourselves so clearly?" Commander Morrison answered for his species. "Because we've been practicing our whole lives, every morning when we wake up, every time.